Okay, so welcome back. Now we're in part two. In this second part, I'd like to address some of the major changes, an overview of some of the major changes from the Age of Empire into the Enlightenment. Now, of course, the Spain's empire would continue into the Enlightenment, but in the early 1700s, there's a change of dynasty from the Habsburgs after a war of the succession. And Spain sees this change of dynasty as a major war between two factions, one that would prefer the Habsburg dynasty to continue, and the other is for a change to the Bourbons. And so the Bourbon dynasty, los Borbones, win the war, and Felipe, the Philip of Anjou, who is of a French lineage, becomes king of Spain in the early 1700s. Why is this significant? Well, with the arrival of the Bourbon dynasty, we also see French, Italian ministers, influences of enlightened thought from different international authors. We see, in other words, that the Habsburgs and their decentralization and way of life and their political philosophy is ushered out in favor of an attempt at a more centralized, top-down form of rule that didn't always meet or wasn't always met, I should say, with the compliance or consensus of ruled subjects. Spain into the Enlightenment and into the 1700s would also see, as I mentioned at the outset of the first presentation, a major restructuring of wealth. And that's part of this major change that we're seeing here uh, that due to the era of colonization and the extrapolation of wealth from the colonies, and particularly the American colonies in the New World, so-called New World, we see colonization and mercantilism, the rise of a bourgeoisie and a wealthy class. That's made its money from trade, banking, even insurances with the American colonies. Now, part of this history is also necessarily the history of the slave trade in the Caribbean. Um, we see that families, very wealthy families, including, for instance, in those that we know by name today, for the Park and Gaudí in Barcelona, the Güells, amass their wealth problematically into from the height of empire into the 1700s through the slave trade and the Caribbean. We see, in other words, that with the rise of these families that have achieved a significant amount of wealth or amassed a significant accumulative significant amount of wealth, we see a new wealthy class that begins to challenge some of the standing noble privileges and aristocratic privileges, both in Spain and its colonies. In other words, we see the presence of an early modern form of new upwardly mobile social class. This is would create new centers of wealth as well and displace some of the old centers of wealth in this process over into the 1700s and even the 1800s, whereby, for example, Seville, which was a bustling, cosmopolitan international capital city, in the empire, one as we see depicted here in this canvas, A View of Seville by Sanchez Coello, at the end of the painted at the end of the 1500s. The Guadalquivir River is a bustling hub of traffic. We have ships who are departing for the New World or departing. And we also have those that are arriving, pay taxes and tributes, and unload goods. We can tell it's Seville because of the Giralda in the background. This is one of the sort of speaking of icons, the characteristic that distinguishes this and makes us recognize it right away as the city of Seville, aside from its river, the Guadalquivir, to know where we are. right? To know what city this is. And we see all the little figures in miniature, the shipbuilding, in military exercises, we see some crosses. We see, in other words, all of the mercantilism in action, as well as the presence of the major influences from this time. That is commerce, the Catholic Church, the Spanish military, and the crown. And then, of course, the precious metals and also goods coming and going to the New World. Of course, in Seville, the House of Contracts was located right across from the cathedral. If you wanted to do business in the New World, you had to get a license first there. And that's why people from all over came to Seville. It's kind of like a New York of its day in a way, just because of the major the population and the mix of peoples from all over. Cervantes tells us in his literature that Seville was a place where many languages were spoken because people were often passing on their way through one place or another or came from far off lands. Now, in the 1700s, we see that there's a shift, as I mentioned before, that cities like Seville would be in this new amassing of wealth, be displaced by other capital and port cities, such as, for example, Cadiz, which was exposed on the Atlantic, very much in the Strait of Gibraltar, open to the Atlantic, and but it was no longer Spain was no longer under the threat of the return of an Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean as it was in the 1500s and 1600s as a perceived threat. Of a military advance and expansion of the Ottoman Empire, which is why so many ports were vulnerable to attack, and that's why Seville was a natural choice because it was upriver. And so Cadiz, more exposed and potentially more vulnerable, was no longer of a concern. It's actually where significant wealth amassed at that time. So the Enlightenment, what was it? It's no longer or it wasn't, it's often referred to as the Age of Reason in Western philosophy. It's synonymous with the 1700s, the long 1700s, but it's no longer that this presumption that people woke up one day and were suddenly enlightened. It's the process by which the old medieval worldview is swept away in favor of rationalization, the sciences, also a form of secularization, which is that in a way Europe loses its religion, so to speak. And this advancement towards the philosophy and arts as we understand them in the modern period. So the scientific method as we know it in today's sciences laboratories and the methods of empiricism um, were founded in the enlightened thought of the laboratories of this time. In other words, as you maybe know, of course, and have practiced from your college studies, at some point, a laboratory is where you place into isolation different elements in an attempt to observe them in a controlled environment to see how they interact with each other, to introduce a new element in and then see how it observe how it interacts, and so on. And this is a kind of knowledge production. It's a controlled knowledge production. This scientific method of empiricism is founded in the principles of enlightened thought. In fact, it would be the laboratories of the 1800s, or excuse me, of the 1700s that would produce some of the precursors to the machines produced in the industrial revolutions of the century to come in the 1800s. This would mean experiments in light, steam, fluid dynamics, hot air, of course, that would be put to work in harnessing engines and the creation of early forms of flight through hot air balloons. These kinds of questions, and even optics that are of the scientific method of its day. Now, in political thought, the age of reason is also tied to this notion that the human is a rational animal, and therefore its rationality, the rational capacity, The logical capacity of human thought is what makes it superior to the animal. This is also problematic. We revisit this today as a kind of justification for a hierarchy of the human above all the animal, or even more problematically, of cultures where the European culture through this, or cultures through this mindset, views itself as naturally equipped to dominate both nature and also other cultures that are not European. We see this in the literature that we're reading for this week. It also, though, believes in a kind of egalitarianism, the notion that this natural born rights that all men, I say men pointedly, because it was part of the thought of the time, are born equal in a kind of egalitarianism. This is the precursor to liberal political theory that we see develop in the 1800s on the heels of the Enlightenment. Then also the early invention of an economic science, the attempt to understand market behaviors, and particularly markets, transactions, and contracts, and even goods that are invested in, like today we would say commodities markets. Where the price of grain in the case of Spain was in the 1700s released to investors to see how it would interact on a market, and it actually was quite disastrous. It led to a revolution because the cost of bread spiked so high that families couldn't afford this item. Nevertheless, the origin of an attempt to document and understand economic science and through markets, transactions, and contracts has its roots in this time. And then, most importantly, for the socio-political critique that we've been discussing in the arts and culture, we have then the abuses of power by the old regime, the nobility, the monarchy, and the Catholic Church in particular, are critiqued increasingly in the Enlightenment as part of this secularization. So, who are some of our enlightened thinkers? We see Rousseau. We also see, right, from left to right. We see Adam Smith, the economist. We see next below him Thomas Paine, who might ring a bell from US history. Then Sir Isaac Newton is one of the very earliest in laboratory, of course, physics experiments. And then, of course, Immanuel Kant, who is building on the tradition of in rethinking philosophy before him, such as Descartes' tradition. I'd like to have a pause for a moment and ask you to look into each one of these figures and what were their major contributions to enlightened thought. Go ahead and pause the video and just take notes briefly of who these thinkers are. We will add to them with the Spanish artist Goya in a moment. Go ahead and take a couple of minutes now. Okay, so the document that is produced as the sort of culmination of enlightened philosophy, political philosophy, is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which is produced in tandem it goes hand in hand with the French Revolution of 1789. And it is ultimately the articulation of a set of rights that were already in circulation in texts, in political philosophy, and thought from this time that would influence the cycle of revolutions, including the US Declaration of Independence in 1776, into the French Revolution of the 1789 and into the mid 1800s as a cycle of revolutions, and other revolutions as well. It would be one of the founding documents that puts forth a sense of egalitarianism and a modern nation state model. And in it, it refers to the notion of a republic or a res publica, in the according to the original Latin, as the state, or the definition of the state as all things that are of public affairs and common interest. This is interesting because there's an interesting public and private divide in all of the philosophy of the Enlightenment. One that can't easily be parceled out in a binary between all that is public is not private and all that is private is not public. But the idea of the state and government is all that is of public affairs of common interest and of governance, and the rest is of private citizens and of private interest. So we see here that what's a summary of the main points put forth in the Declaration of Rights of the Man and the Citizen. First, that there is a universal natural born right to property, liberty, and equality of life. This is sometimes referred to in the United States context as a quality of life as a pursuit of happiness sometimes. So these universal natural rights, however, extended exclusively at this time to male property owners and heads of household. The idea that family units were those that organized life, and therefore the male head of household in every family unit would be the person with a voice, vote, and represent the interests of of the estate, and that includes all who live on it, including, in the case of slavery, the history of slavery, the voice and votes of of slaves. So we see too that in this notion, this universal in theory notion, sovereignty is defined as residing in the people, not in the divine right of kings or in the voice of a king. Now we see that in Hobbes, the image that we saw is one of a sovereign, of a king who is constituted by all of his subjects, right? And that's the first articulation that we have of this notion of of a commonwealth, or of the group of people who are constituted, and instead supplant or replace the king as sovereign figure with instead this plurality of people, right? We also see, interestingly, in the Declaration of Rights and the Man and the Citizen, the separation of powers in the state. If in the absolute monarch, the sovereign, when he spoke, his voice would speak law into existence. He was a legislative body, literally. When he spoke, he could also give orders and execute those orders, which meant that he also then was an executive branch. And then lastly, his voice, consolidated into these three powers, was one who could choose to pardon or could choose to condemn. And so it was a judicial branch as well in the interpretation of the law. So we see that these three powers were in an absolute monarch consolidated in one voice. And there was an interest in articulating how they could be segregated or separated into three different powers, in order to keep them, as what we understand in the US model, to be a checks and balances between the three. Also, the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen establishes, as a process of secularization, a separation of church and state, so that the modern nation state is governed by the people, and it is secular, it is non-denominational. It has no religion, so to speak, but that its religion is a private matter. And that way we see then that this new people as the founding subject of sovereignty is also in a group of citizens. And this is interesting too, because this is the century then when there begins to be an articulation of who can be a citizen, who cannot, who can have their citizenship created or acquired, and who has it revoked. That's another question as well. Here we see an icon image we'll discuss later in this course of Lady Liberty. You might know, of course, that this is Lady Liberty leading the people to the barricades. Is the icon, of course, the same image of Lady Liberty, the gifted from France to the United States, is the Statue of Liberty. And we will see her again as the model for the Spanish Republic in Republican democracy in the 1930s. Okay, so Goya. Goya is an enlightened thinker. Goya is someone who had read the French philosophy or the enlightened philosophers, and in fact, he would get the nickname, of course, of one of the afrancesados, or someone who was under French influence from the 1700s, at the very end of the Enlightenment into the early 1800s. And he produces a series of etchings in the late 1700s which he titles the Caprices, Los Caprichos. Oh, caprice. What is caprice? Go ahead and look it up. What is it? What does it mean? It gives us the sense that it's here these plates, which are each one a social satire or critique of the ways of life in Spain or of the old regime, the monarchy, nobility, unenlightened society or the church as as a scathing critique that should somehow not be taken too seriously. It's almost like frivolous here. And with this sense of irony gets away in a with this critique. So he published a book. Each one of these pages is a different print from an etching, an original etching. And I'd like to pause and ask you to analyze each one of these images from left to right. The first, the left-hand side, the question we have to govern our visual reading of all three. First, what do you see? Observe what's going on in the scene. Bring the text into it if you find meaning in the text in relationship to the scene. And then lastly, how is this an enlightened critique? So to the far left, plate number two, el sí pronuncian y la mano alargan al primero que llega, which is they say yes, or rather they say I do, and extend their hand to the first who comes. What do you see in this image? What's going on in it? And how is it an enlightened critique in Goya? Okay, go ahead and pause. Okay, so once you have that in your notes, then go ahead and work with the second plate, the center one, Al Conde Palatino, to Count Palatino. This is plate number 33. What do you see? What's going on with these characters, these figures? And then how is this an enlightened critique of the old regime in Spain? Go ahead and pause here. And then lastly, we have plate number 80, Ya es hora. What do you see here? And how is this final plate a critique of the Enlightenment or a critique, is it an enlightened critique of Spain? Go ahead and take a moment. Okay, so once you have your notes about each one of these plates, um, we can see overall that Goya is critiquing both the aristocracy, the nobility, and its abuses of power. We can see very clearly in one of the plates how there are unenlightened social practices where families marry and particularly marry daughters into wealthy families for gain. And then, of course, we also see how there is an ambiguous critique of, but very clear is this demonizing critique of the Catholic Church in making monks and friars look in a superstitious way, almost like devils and monsters, right? It's an incredibly rife critique and potentially even an iconoclast one if we talk about how this was viewed as controversial, polemical, and particularly at a time when the Catholic Church is still in operation with the Inquisition, which wouldn't be disbanded until the early 1800s. So the plate that most represents the critique of the enlightened critique in the Caprichos is this one here, which is El sueño de la razón produce monstruos, or the dream of reason produces monsters. And here we see this is scripted on the desk. We have the artist who is taking a nap or has fallen asleep at his desk. And then we have all kinds of a cacophony of monsters, a lynx, in the foreground, this very large cat looking back at us, with, of course, all these owls and bats. It looks like the nightmare that is haunting the artist. And there is the reading that the dream of reason, when reason lies dormant, then monsters come forth. It produces monsters. This idea, political philosophy as well, that when if the human capacity lets its rationale lie dormant, then the monsters will return, the unenlightened will return, the animals. And that's part of why Goya in this frame is considered to be, this frame is considered to be the most representative of an enlightened critique in the Caprichos. But there are certainly many other reasons for the statement as to why his Caprichos resemble or capture enlightened thought. Okay, so this is where we end for today, and you will want to take a look at the readings to further understand and have in your notes how Goya forms part of a process of secularization, and what that means for enlightened thought in the arts at this time. All right, thanks very much.